The rain had been falling since morning, heavy and endless, soaking the earth and filling the air with the smell of wet leaves and mud. The sky hung low and gray, and the forest at the edge of the road looked like a watercolor painting, blurred by mist and rainfall. Clara Evans, a wildlife photographer, had been driving for hours, her camera bag resting on the seat beside her. It had been one of those disappointing days when nothing went as planned. No good shots, no sightings, just silence and rain. Her car tires splashed through muddy puddles as she made her way down the narrow dirt trail that cut through the woods. She rubbed her tired eyes and sighed. All she wanted was to get home, make a cup of tea, and forget how unkind the weather had been. But as she reached for her wipers to clear the foggy windshield, something outside caught her eye. At first, she thought it was just a pile of fallen branches, dark and small under a leaning tree. But then one of the shapes moved, a twitch, a tiny shiver. Clara leaned closer, squinting through the rain. Her heart gave a sudden jolt. They weren't branches at all. There, under the half-broken tree, were 3 small predator cubs. Their fur was drenched and clung tightly to their fragile bodies. They sat close together, trembling in the cold, their eyes wide and shiny, reflecting fear and confusion. One of them gave a weak cry, barely audible over the rain. Clara felt her stomach tighten. She had seen wild animals in distress before, but never like this. There was something heartbreakingly human in the way they leaned against each other, trying to stay warm. She turned off the car engine and just sat there for a moment, her breath fogging up the glass again. Her mind was torn between 2 thoughts, to get out and help or to stay put. Every rule she had learned as a photographer echoed in her head. Never interfere with nature. It was a lesson repeated over and over. The balance of the wild should not be disturbed. But another voice inside her whispered, "They won't survive this." She reached for her camera, then stopped halfway. What was she doing? This wasn't a moment to capture. It was a moment to feel. She glanced around the forest, scanning for any sign of the mother. Usually, predator mothers stayed close, watching from a distance, ready to return once the danger passed. But the woods were silent except for the sound of raindrops hitting the leaves. No movement, no growl, no shadow. The realization slowly sank in. If their mother wasn't nearby, something terrible must have happened. The cubs had been left alone, helpless against the cold and the rain. Clara felt her pulse quicken. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she wrestled with what to do next. She couldn't just drive away. The image of the cubs shivering under the broken tree burned in her mind. She thought about how small and defenseless they looked, and suddenly her camera didn't matter anymore. Her career didn't matter. What mattered was that 3 little lives were sitting out there in the rain, and she was the only one who knew. With a deep breath, she opened the car door. The cold air rushed in, sharp and wet, making her shiver. She pulled her jacket tighter around herself and stepped into the downpour. The sound of her boots squelching in the mud mixed with the patter of rain. Her heart raced as she took slow, careful steps toward the tree. The cubs noticed her immediately, their tiny heads lifted, eyes fixed on her. She stopped a few feet away, not wanting to frighten them. They didn't move, only stared, their bodies shaking harder now. Clara knelt slightly, lowering herself to their level. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "It's okay," she murmured, though she knew they couldn't understand her words. "It's all right. I won't hurt you." The rain fell heavier, running down her face, soaking her clothes, but she stayed where she was, watching the cubs, waiting to see what they would do. For a moment, no one moved. Not her, not them. Only the rain filled the space between them. And in that quiet, shivering stillness, Clara realized something deep inside her. Sometimes the wild doesn't need a witness. It needs a heart willing to act. Clara sat in her car, her heart beating faster than the rain hitting the windshield. The wipers moved back and forth, trying to clear the view, but the world outside looked like a moving painting of gray and green. She could see the cubs under the broken tree, still huddled together, still trembling. Every few seconds, one of them let out a faint cry, soft, scared, and full of helplessness. She pressed her hand against the window and whispered, "Oh, you poor little ones." Her voice cracked. The cold air inside the car fogged the glass again, but she didn't move. She just sat there, torn between what she had always been taught and what her heart was begging her to do. For years she had lived by one rule: never interfere with nature. Her mentor's words were still sharp in her memory. You're there to observe, not to change the story. The wild knows how to survive. It was a line she had repeated to herself countless times on assignments, even when she saw animals struggling. But this time those words didn't feel right. These cubs were too young, too fragile, too soaked to survive the freezing rain. She bit her lip, watching them through the misty glass, and felt a wave of guilt wash over her. She knew the rule was meant to protect the natural balance, but what balance was left when death was waiting just beyond the next thunderclap? The sound of thunder rumbled above the trees, deep and powerful. The cubs flinched. One of them tried to crawl closer to the fallen trunk for cover, but slipped and fell back beside its siblings. That tiny movement broke something inside Clara. She felt a lump rise in her throat. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to convince herself that nature would find a way, that the mother would come back. She must be nearby, she said out loud as if trying to make it true. But deep down, she knew. If the mother had been alive, she would never have left them alone in a storm like this. The silence of the forest said it all. She turned off the engine and the sudden quiet felt heavy. All she could hear was the rain pounding on the car roof and her own heartbeat. The thought of leaving those cubs behind made her stomach twist. She imagined driving away and then reading about their bodies being found by rangers the next morning. That image was too painful to bear. They won't survive the night, she whispered again, her voice breaking this time. Her hands trembled as she ran them through her damp hair. She had photographed countless wild animals, lions, wolves, bears, but she had never felt this helpless. Her instincts told her to help. Her training told her to stay back. She was stuck between what was right by the book and what was right by her heart. Clara leaned her forehead against the steering wheel, closing her eyes. The smell of wet fabric and rain filled the car. She could almost hear her mentor's voice again, calm and strict. Every time you interfere, you change the story of the wild. But maybe, she thought, some stories are meant to be changed. She opened her eyes and looked outside again. The cubs were still there, smaller than ever under the stormy sky. They didn't know rules or ethics. They only knew fear, cold, and hunger. If I were them, she murmured, I'd want someone to care. For a long minute, she sat there in silence, staring at the trembling little shapes under the tree. The lightning flashed once more, lighting up the forest like daylight. The cubs curled tighter together, their cries lost in the wind. That was when Clara finally knew she couldn't just sit there any longer. She reached for her rain jacket, pulling it around her shoulders. Her hands were shaking, not from fear of the animals, but from the decision she had just made. I'm sorry, she whispered to the empty seat beside her as if speaking to her mentor. But I can't pretend I didn't see them. With one deep breath, she opened the car door. The cold wind rushed in, stinging her face and filling the car with the scent of rain and earth. She stepped out slowly, her boots sinking slightly into the mud. The rain soaked her hair instantly, but she didn't care. Her heart was heavy, but her steps were sure. Somewhere between the sound of thunder and the soft cries of the cubs, Clara realized that this was no longer about photographs or rules. It was about compassion, the one thing that made her human in a world that often forgot what that meant. The sound of rain was louder now, beating against the car like endless drumming. Clara sat frozen for a few seconds, her heart torn between fear and determination. The sight of those tiny, helpless cubs curled under the broken tree was something she couldn't unsee. They looked smaller now, almost lifeless, their fur plastered to their thin bodies. She felt a wave of warmth spread through her chest. Not the good kind, but the one that comes from guilt. I can't just sit here, she whispered. Her fingers trembled as she reached for her waterproof jacket from the back seat. The smell of wet earth drifted in through the half-open window, reminding her how cold it must be for those little creatures outside. When she stepped out of the car, the first raindrops hit her face like ice. The cold was sharp, biting through her clothes instantly. The world was a blur of gray and sound. The splash of puddles, the whisper of wind through the trees, and the soft thunder rolling somewhere far away. She pulled her hood over her head, zipped up her jacket, and began to walk toward the tree. Each step she took made her heart beat faster. Her boots sank into the mud, making soft squelching sounds, but she didn't stop. The cubs lifted their tiny heads when they heard her approaching. For a brief moment they froze, their little eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Clara slowed down, moving as gently as she could. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I won't hurt you." The words felt strange on her lips. She wasn't sure if they could understand her, but somehow speaking them made her feel calmer. The cubs blinked slowly, too weak to move, too cold to be afraid for long. Clara knelt down a few feet away, rain dripping off her hood. Her knees pressed into the wet soil, but she didn't care. The cubs stared back at her, their breaths quick and shallow. The smallest one let out a weak, pitiful whimper, and that sound pierced through Clara's chest like a knife. She had heard the cries of wild animals before, but never one so soft, so helpless, so full of silent pleading. She opened her jacket slightly and stretched it toward them, showing her empty hands. "See, it's just me," she said quietly. The rain blurred her vision as she leaned closer, inch by inch, careful not to startle them. She could see their little paws now, muddy and trembling, their fur stuck together in wet clumps. One of the cubs sniffed the air, its nose twitching as it tried to make sense of her scent. Another shifted slightly, pressing against its sibling for comfort. Clara's heart ached. They didn't even have the energy to move away. That was when she knew, if she left now, they wouldn't last another hour. She took a deep breath and carefully slipped off her jacket. The cold air hit her instantly, but she ignored it. She spread the jacket open on the muddy ground, close enough for the cubs to see it. "Come on," she murmured softly. "It's warm. You can trust me." She waited, her heart pounding, as the cubs stared at the fabric like it was something foreign and strange. The rain continued to pour, dripping down her hair and soaking her shirt, but she didn't move an inch. Then, something amazing happened. The smallest cub, the one that had whimpered, moved first. It took one uncertain step forward, then another, its paws sinking into the mud. It crawled toward the open jacket, shivering violently. Clara held her breath, afraid that any movement would scare it away. The cub reached the jacket and pressed its tiny body against the soft fabric. The warmth must have felt comforting because it let out a soft, almost relieved sigh. The other two cubs hesitated for only a moment before following. Soon all three were huddled together on her jacket, their heads tucked close, their bodies pressed for warmth. Clara watched them with tears mixing into the rain on her face. She gently pulled the edges of her jacket around them, creating a small cocoon of warmth in the middle of the storm. The cubs didn't resist. They didn't snarl or bite. They simply sank into the safety of her touch, their trembling slowing bit by bit. In that moment, Clara felt a strange calm settle over her. The rain was still falling, the sky still roaring, but around her, time seemed to stop. She knelt there in the mud, holding three small lives against her, feeling their fragile heartbeats through the fabric. She looked up toward the dark sky and whispered, "You're safe now." It wasn't part of her plan, and it wasn't what her training had prepared her for, but it was what her heart told her to do. Sometimes, she thought, the right choice isn't the one that follows the rules, but the one that follows compassion. For a few long seconds, everything around Clara was still except for the sound of rain falling heavily on the forest floor. The jacket she had laid open on the ground grew darker as it soaked through. But the cubs didn't move. They simply stared at her, tiny and unsure, their little bodies shaking from the cold. Clara kept her voice low and calm, her hands steady even though her heart was pounding. "It's all right," she whispered, her breath visible in the cold air. "You can trust me." She stayed perfectly still, not wanting to rush them. The forest felt alive with silence, the kind of silence that comes before something important happens. Her knees were buried in mud, her hair stuck to her face, but she didn't notice any of it. Her eyes were fixed on the cubs, waiting for one of them to make the first move. Then slowly, it happened. The smallest cub lifted its head, blinking water from its eyes. It looked at her jacket, then at her. Its little nose twitched as it sniffed the air cautiously. With a weak, uncertain motion, it crawled forward, its paws sinking into the mud. Clara held her breath, afraid to move or even blink. When the cub reached the edge of the jacket, it hesitated for only a second before curling up on the fabric. It pressed its body against the soft, warm inside of her coat, as though it had finally found something familiar. Comfort. The sight of it broke something inside Clara. She felt a lump in her throat, tears mixing with the raindrops on her cheeks. The other two cubs didn't take long to follow. They looked at the smallest one, then shuffled forward, clumsy and frightened, but drawn to the warmth. One nestled its head under the other's chin, and soon all three were huddled together in the center of her jacket. Their tiny bodies shook less now as they pressed close to one another, finding safety in their shared warmth. Clara reached forward carefully, wrapping the sides of her jacket around them. The moment her hands brushed their damp fur, she felt a surge of emotion so strong it nearly made her cry. These were wild creatures, animals people feared and avoided. Yet here they were, trusting her completely. The rain didn't stop, and the cold seeped through her clothes until her shirt clung to her skin. Her hands were numb, her legs ached, but none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was the small bundle of life in her arms. She lifted the cubs slightly, holding them against her chest so they could feel her warmth. They were heavier than she expected, their tiny hearts beating fast against her. She looked down at them, unable to believe what she was doing, kneeling in the mud, in the middle of a storm, cradling 3 predator cubs like children. Clara tilted her head toward the dark sky, rain hitting her face, and whispered softly, "You're safe now." The words came naturally, as if she had been waiting all her life to say them. She wasn't sure if they were meant for the cubs or for herself, but in that moment, they felt right. She felt something deep inside her shift, something that went beyond fear, beyond instinct. It was a quiet understanding between 2 worlds that were never meant to meet. She wasn't a savior, and they weren't dangerous. They were simply lives, fragile and real, sharing warmth in the middle of a storm. As the minutes passed, the cubs stopped shaking completely. One of them let out a soft sound, almost like a sigh, before resting its head against her arm. Clara smiled, the kind of small, tired smile that comes from relief. She looked around the forest, the gray trees, the rippling puddles, the mist, and realized how strange and beautiful this moment was. She was drenched, freezing, and covered in mud, but she had never felt more alive. Her camera was still sitting in the car, forgotten. For once, she didn't need it. No photograph could ever capture what she felt right now. The weight of their trust, the softness of their fur against her skin, the sound of their quiet breathing mixed with the rain. This was something she would remember not because she captured it through a lens, but because she lived it. Clara sat there for a long time, holding the cubs close as the rain began to ease. The forest slowly came back to life with small sounds, raindrops slipping off leaves, the distant call of a bird. And in that peaceful quiet, Clara understood something that no book or rule could have taught her. Sometimes compassion doesn't ask for permission. Sometimes doing the right thing means breaking your own rules. And in that muddy clearing, with 3 tiny lives pressed against her heart, she realized that the most unthinkable moments can also be the most human ones. Clara's arms ached, but she didn't let go. The cubs were pressed against her chest inside the jacket, their small bodies shivering softly against her. The rain hadn't stopped, and the cold air stung her skin as she stood up from the muddy ground. Her heart raced with panic and urgency. She knew she couldn't keep them out here. They were too weak, too fragile. Their fur was still dripping wet, and their breathing was shallow and uneven. "Hold on," she whispered to them as if they could understand. "I'll get you warm." She pulled the jacket tighter around them and hurried through the rain toward her car, her boots splashing through puddles, her breath coming out in fast, cloudy bursts. When she reached the car, she quickly opened the door and slid into the driver's seat, keeping one arm wrapped around the cubs. They whimpered quietly, but she could tell they were calming down little by little. The car smelled of wet fabric and mud. Her fingers were trembling as she started the engine. The headlights flickered on, cutting through the curtain of rain that still poured outside. She turned the heater to full, feeling the warm air slowly fill the space. Steam began to rise from her wet clothes, but she ignored the discomfort. Her attention was on the tiny bundle in her lap. "You're okay now," she whispered, gently adjusting her jacket so the warm air could reach them. She knew she couldn't take them home. That would be wrong. They needed real help from professionals, maybe even a chance to reunite with their mother if she was still alive. Her hands were shaking as she reached for her phone. The screen was slippery from the rain, but she managed to type "Local Wildlife Rescue" into the search bar. It took a few tries before a number appeared. She pressed the call button with her heart in her throat, hoping someone would answer quickly. After a few rings, a calm voice came on the line. "Wildlife Rescue Center, how can I help you?" Clara didn't waste a second. "I found predator cubs," she said, her voice breathless. "3 of them. They're freezing and alone. I can't just leave them." There was a pause on the other end, the kind that makes seconds feel like minutes. Then the voice spoke again, more serious now. "All right, ma'am. Please stay where you are. Do not separate from them or try to feed them. We'll send a rescue team right away. Can you share your location?" Clara gave directions as clearly as she could, glancing out at the dark road and the blurry outlines of trees. The person on the phone reassured her that help was on the way, then asked her to keep them warm until the team arrived. "Just don't panic," the voice said gently. "You're doing the right thing." Clara ended the call and exhaled deeply, her body shaking from the cold and adrenaline. She reached to the back seat and grabbed the small blanket she always carried for long drives. She spread it out carefully and wrapped it around the cubs one by one, tucking the edges under them like a makeshift nest. They were still shivering, but not as violently now. The warmth from the heater and the blanket seemed to work slowly, bit by bit. One of them lifted its head, blinking sleepily, while another rested its paw against the first one as if to hold on. The smallest cub let out a faint sigh and buried its face in the fabric. Clara couldn't help but smile, her heart softening. "There you go," she whispered. "You're safe now." Her jacket and shirt were completely soaked, and her hands were numb, but the sight of those little lives beginning to calm down filled her with warmth far stronger than the heater could give. She leaned back in her seat, still keeping one hand gently over them, feeling their faint breaths against her palm. Outside, the storm began to ease slightly, the rain falling lighter now, the thunder growing distant. The forest that had felt so dark and dangerous earlier now seemed quiet and peaceful, as if holding its breath with her. The headlights reflected off the wet road ahead, but Clara didn't plan to move until help arrived. She kept glancing at the cubs, making sure they were still breathing steadily. Minutes passed, and slowly their breathing grew stronger. The shaking stopped. One of them even made a soft, sleepy noise that almost sounded like a purr. Clara felt tears sting her eyes, not from sadness, but from relief. For the first time that night, she felt hope. She looked at them and said softly, "You're going to make it. Just hang in there." As she waited, the world outside the car seemed to fade. There was only the sound of the rain, the soft hum of the heater, and the quiet rhythm of 3 tiny hearts finally beginning to rest. It wasn't much, but in that moment, sitting in a lonely forest road in the middle of a storm, Clara realized she had done something good, something that mattered. Time seemed to move slowly as Clara sat in her car, the rain still falling steadily. She checked her watch again. It had been almost 30 minutes since she'd called for help. The cubs were now asleep inside the blanket, their tiny chests rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The warmth from the heater had filled the car, and for the first time since she found them, Clara allowed herself to breathe. But a part of her still worried. What if the rescue team didn't come soon enough? What if the cubs got sick? She glanced at them again, their small bodies curled together, and whispered, "Hold on, little ones. Help is coming." Just then, a flash of headlights cut through the misty forest road. Clara's heart jumped. She sat up straight, peering through the rain-streaked window. A white van slowly pulled up behind her car, its tires crunching over wet gravel. The words "Wildlife Rescue Unit" were faintly visible on the side. 2 figures stepped out, wearing thick waterproof jackets and carrying equipment bags. The rain bounced off their hoods as they hurried toward her car. One of them, a tall man with kind eyes, tapped on her window. "Are you the one who called?" he asked. Clara nodded quickly, opening the door. The officers looked at her, visibly surprised. She was completely drenched, her hair stuck to her forehead, her hands trembling as she held the bundled cubs against her chest. "You really did the unthinkable," the man said softly, his expression filled with awe. The other officer, a woman, leaned closer and gently lifted the edge of the blanket. Her eyes widened slightly. "They're still warm," she said. "You may have just saved their lives." Clara smiled weakly, tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. "I couldn't leave them," she said in a shaky voice. They were freezing. They were all alone. Her words caught in her throat. The officers exchanged a quick, understanding glance. The woman reached into her bag and pulled out 3 small towels, wrapping each cub with gentle precision. The cubs stirred a little but didn't cry. One let out a soft sound as if sensing they were safe now. Watching them, Clara felt her chest tighten with emotion. She hadn't realized until now how much fear she'd been carrying. Seeing professionals take over filled her with a quiet relief. The officers moved carefully, transferring the cubs into a small, heated carrier inside their van. The warmth from the blankets and the gentle hum of the machine made the cubs settle down almost instantly. Clara stood in the rain, watching every movement as if afraid that blinking would make the moment disappear. When the last cub was secured inside, she finally let out a deep sigh. "Will they be okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. The male officer turned to her and gave a reassuring nod. "They're strong little ones," he said. "You found them just in time. If you hadn't stayed, they wouldn't have survived the night." The words hit her hard. She looked at the van, her vision blurring with tears. She didn't feel like a hero, just someone who couldn't walk away. "Where's their mother?" she asked quietly. The woman officer hesitated, her expression turning somber. "We believe she was killed earlier this week," she said softly. "We've had reports of poachers in this area. It's been happening a lot lately." The rain suddenly felt heavier as those words sank in. Clara's stomach turned, a mix of sorrow and anger building inside her. She couldn't imagine the fear and pain that Mother must have faced, and now her babies had almost suffered the same fate. Clara pressed her lips together, trying to steady her voice. "So they're orphans now?" she asked. The man nodded gently. "Yes, but they'll be cared for. Our sanctuary takes in rescued cubs like these. They'll have warmth, food, and safety until they're old enough to live on their own." That gave Clara a small sense of comfort. She watched as they closed the van doors and started the engine. The red taillights glowed faintly through the rain. For a moment, everything around her felt quiet again. No thunder, no fear. Just the steady rhythm of raindrops hitting the earth. As the rescue van began to pull away, Clara stood there soaked and exhausted, her arms now empty but her heart strangely full. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, unsure if it was rain or tears. She looked up at the dark sky and whispered, "Thank you." Maybe it was to the universe, maybe to the cub's mother. She wasn't sure. All she knew was that they were safe now, and that was enough. Getting back into her car, she sat for a moment, staring at her wet jacket lying on the seat beside her. It was covered in mud, its fabric heavy and cold. But to her it felt like the most precious thing she owned. It had carried life. As she drove home slowly through the rain, she realized that sometimes doing the unthinkable is what makes us human. Choosing compassion when it's easier to look away. The rain had finally stopped, and the following days brought a quiet calm to the small town. The roads were dry again, and the forest that had once looked dark and heavy with clouds now shimmered with sunlight. Clara sat in her living room, sipping tea, her camera lying on the table beside her. It still had mud on it from that stormy night. She hadn't planned to share anything about what happened. She had gone out that evening for pictures of wildlife, not to become the story herself. But when she finally checked her camera, she found that it had captured something she hadn't realized. Blurry but powerful shots of her kneeling in the rain, her jacket spread open with the 3 small cubs tucked safely inside. Somehow, during that emotional rush, The camera hanging around her neck had clicked a few times on its own. When she saw those images, she sat still for a long time, her eyes wet, remembering the warmth of the cubs against her chest and the sound of the storm around them. At first, she thought about keeping the photos private. They felt too personal, a moment between her and those tiny lives. But a friend from the rescue center visited a few days later, checking on how she was doing. He saw the photos and gently said, "People should see this. They need to be reminded that compassion still exists." Clara hesitated but agreed to share one photo with the local wildlife organization, hoping it might encourage donations for animal rescue work. What she didn't expect was what happened next. Within a single day, the image was everywhere. Someone from the organization posted it online with a simple caption, "She opened her jacket so they could live." The photo spread across social media faster than Clara could imagine. Within hours, thousands of people began sharing it. Comments poured in from around the world, messages of love, admiration, and gratitude. People called it the Night of Kindness. Some said the photo made them cry. Others said it reminded them to be better, to care more, to act when others turn away. News channels reached out, wildlife groups featured her story, and donations began flooding into the rescue organization. What started as one woman's quiet act of compassion had turned into something much bigger, a wave of kindness that seemed to touch every heart it reached. Still, through all the noise, Clara stayed grounded. She didn't like being called a hero. When reporters asked her how it felt to be famous, she only smiled and said, "I didn't save them. They saved a part of me I didn't know was missing." And she meant it. Those cubs had reminded her of something simple but powerful, that real photography isn't just about capturing beauty, it's about capturing truth. That night, she hadn't just saved animals. She had rediscovered her own humanity. She realized that kindness wasn't about grand gestures or fame. It was about being there in that single moment, doing what was right, even when no one was watching. People who had grown tired of reading bad news found hope in her story. Teachers shared her picture in classrooms to talk about compassion. Wildlife groups named new rescue programs after her. Even strangers sent letters saying how her simple act had reminded them to care more deeply for animals, for people, and for the world around them. One message that touched her most came from a woman across the ocean who wrote, "You may never meet us, but you reminded us what love looks like when it has no reason to exist except itself." Clara often looked at the framed copy of that photo on her desk. It showed her sitting in the pouring rain, hair dripping, jacket open, with 3 little cubs pressed close for warmth. To others, it was a picture of courage. To her, it was a picture of connection, a reminder that in a world full of walls, one act of kindness could still build a bridge between 2 very different lives. Whenever she saw it, she would smile softly and whisper the same words she had said that night under the stormy sky. "You're safe now." Months slipped by, and the world around Clara slowly moved back to normal. The noise of the viral story faded, but the memory of that night never left her. Every now and then, she would call the wildlife sanctuary to check on the cubs. The staff told her they were growing fast, learning to hunt, and getting stronger each day. Hearing that always brought a soft smile to her face. Those tiny creatures she once held close to her chest were no longer fragile. They had survived, and they were beginning to live the life nature had intended for them. Still, a part of her longed to see them again, to make sure they truly were safe. When the sanctuary finally invited her to visit before the cubs' release, she agreed without hesitation. The drive to the sanctuary felt different from the one she took that stormy night. The sky was bright this time, the air clear and full of warmth. The forest roads that had once looked frightening in the rain now seemed peaceful, glowing with sunlight filtering through the leaves. When Clara arrived, a young caretaker greeted her at the gate and led her through the paths lined with tall trees and wooden fences. The sounds of birds filled the air, mixed with the rustle of leaves. Her heart raced with anticipation as they approached the open enclosure where the cubs were kept. She could hear them before she saw them, soft growls, playful sounds, and the thud of paws against the earth, and then she saw them. 3 young predators, bigger now, their fur thick and shiny under the sun. They looked strong, confident, and beautiful. Nothing like the trembling, soaked little creatures she had once found huddled in the rain. The sight brought tears to her eyes. She stood quietly by the fence, watching them play with each other, chasing shadows and rolling in the grass. "They've come so far," the caretaker said beside her with a smile. "You gave them a chance?" Clara shook her head slowly, her eyes still on the cubs. "No," she said softly. "They gave me one." As if hearing her voice, one of the cubs stopped playing. It turned its head and looked toward her. For a moment, everything around her went silent. Their eyes met, the same dark, curious eyes she had seen months ago under that broken tree. The cub tilted its head slightly, and Clara's heart skipped a beat. It was as if it remembered. Maybe it didn't truly know who she was, but something in its gaze felt familiar, a quiet recognition that went beyond words. Clara smiled through the blur of her tears. "You're home now," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. The cub blinked once more, then turned back to the others and ran into the sunlight. Clara stood there for a while longer, letting the moment settle in her heart. It wasn't sadness she felt, but peace. The cubs didn't need her anymore. And that was the best ending she could have hoped for. As she turned to leave, the wind brushed gently against her face, carrying the faint scent of rain even though the sky was clear. She walked slowly back toward her car, her shoes crunching softly against the gravel path. Just as she reached the end of the trail, a ray of sunlight broke through the clouds above, spreading a golden glow across the trees. It felt almost like a silent goodbye, a reminder from the world that kindness, once given, never really disappears. She looked up at the sky and smiled, remembering that stormy night, the cold rain, and the fear she had felt. Everything had changed since then, not just for the cubs, but for her. That night had taught her something she would never forget. Compassion doesn't care about species, language, or size. It doesn't stop to ask if it's convenient or logical. It simply acts guided by the quiet voice of the heart. And sometimes even the smallest act, like opening a jacket in the middle of a storm, can ripple through the world like thunder, reaching places and hearts you never meant to touch. As she started the car and drove away, Clara glanced one last time at the sanctuary in her rearview mirror. She didn't take any photos this time. Some moments, she thought, don't belong behind a lens. They belong in your soul.